Managing Editor here at VoxDev, and welcome to today's webinar on helping schools to thrive, looking at the opportunities for impact investment in global education. We are really excited to be joined by Sandeep Aneja, Jishnu Das, Steve Hardgrave, Asim Ijaz, Khwaja, and Laura Savage. Sandeep is the founder and managing partner of Kaizenvest, which is an education-focused fund management firm. Jishnu is a distinguished professor of public policy at the McCourt School of Public Policy and the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Steve is executive director of Varthana, which is the largest school loan company and the fastest growing student loan company in India. We have Asim, who is the director of the Harvard Center for International Development, with whom we are collaborating on today's event. And he is also the Sumitomo Foundation for Advanced Studies on International Development Professor of International Finance and Development at the Harvard Kennedy School. And then we also have Laura, who is the Executive Director of the International Education Funders Group, which is the largest global network of philanthropic actors funding education. So, as a panel, during these difficult times for global education funding, we're going to discuss whether there are viable opportunities for impact investors to step in and help schools thrive. I'm going to begin with some quick fire questions to each member of our panel before asking a couple of broader questions that the panel will discuss amongst themselves. And then we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, please ask them using the Q&A function on Zoom, where you can also vote on those that you would like to see answered. So to start, we're going to turn to Jishnu and Asim. So I was hoping you could briefly summarize what your recent research in this area has found and what the implication of these results are at this moment for global education.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver, and a pleasure to be here with very distinguished panelists. Let me just quickly take one part of the question, and I'll leave the second half to Asim, which is I want to frame that question a little bit, right, Oliver? And kind of three pieces for that framing. I mean, the first is, look, there's been a huge growth in private primary schooling. Right. So around the world, it's almost 30% of kids in primary schools are now in private schools. And in South Asia, where we work, that number is closer to 45 to 50%. Right. So if we are serious about making sure that every child learns, we have to be serious about ensuring that the kids in private schools are getting the learning they need to thrive. Right. The second kind of context defining feature is these schools close down quite often, right? So a number from the US for those joining from the US is, look, charter schools close down at about the rate of 5% a year. In our samples, depending upon which year, which period, we have a paper showing that about 30%, 40% of schools will close down over an 8 to 10 year period, right? These closures are pretty costly. Schooling is disrupted, all kinds of things happen. And one thing we want to think about pretty seriously is, forget what these closures do. We want to think about, can we think about policies that actually help schools survive, right? And if we can think about such policies, then we can decide, are these policies good or bad? The first step is to say, can we affect school survival, right? The third defining feature, and then I'll pass on to Asim what we actually did, is look, when people think about private schools, they think about it in two ways. They think about panic, panic, panic. Whoa, private schools, bad for people. Overnight, they're going to take stuff. It's going to be a mess and shut them down, shut them down, shut them down. Right? That's one way. And then suddenly you see a switch and you say, private schools, private schools, private schools, opportunity, give them money, give them money, give them money. No, I want to move in between that and say, look, I'm all for saying private schools are in the private sector. There's definitely one model where you say, I'm going to bring in public money to support private schools. I think those models are really complicated. I think those models come with a host of regulatory and conflict of interest issues that we have insufficiently addressed. So the third context-specific thing that I want to talk about is, look, we need to come up with private solutions for private schools. And that's what I think about briefly as impact investing. And so if we put these three together, we say we want to help kids in private schools. We want to help private schools, or we at least want to understand whether policies can help private schools survive, and we want to do it with private money. Is there a way that we can produce financial impact, which is what private sector investors want, and social impact that help schools survive? That's going to be our framing, or at least my framing discussion on this. And I'll pass on to Asim to tell us what we did.
Great. Thanks, Jishnu. So just to continue kind of the thread Jishnu said, so look, our role in this conversation, and it's great to be in this virtual room together with the whole range of expertise we would need to kind of realize what Jishnu just said. Our role has primarily been as researchers. And so we've now been working for, it's about 2.5 decades now in education in Pakistan, and we've been studying kind of the education ecosystem in general, and as Jishnu said, the critical role that the low-cost private sector in particular is playing. And this conversation in particular is going to draw on, there have been several studies we've done in this period. I would say the big summary of all of these studies is to say, look, the private sector is a key player in this space. And it's a player which both gives affordability, accessibility, and quality, right? So it's a central player. And that's increasingly true. We've done a lot of work in Pakistan, but this is increasingly true across the world. Now, the conversation the specific one we're having today is, as Jishnu said, what are private solutions, particularly private financing solutions in this space for the private sector? And there are two relevant studies we have that speak to this. When we first started, when we entered the space, we didn't have folk like ourselves in this room who are actually actively investing in the impact investing space in education. So we started more with a grants project where we basically gave grant money to private schools. And what we were really trying to do is to say, look, can we precisely estimate the private and social return of giving money to this low-cost private sector? And the kind of challenge we'd put ourselves up was to say, a lot of times when we invest, we do a lot of due diligence. And that's important and good to do. But we were actually testing that even if you didn't do due diligence, if you just literally did what is the equivalent of a helicopter cash drop on the average private school, and this is critical to understand, on the average private school in our context, what kind of returns would you expect? And this was also light. It wasn't money with any conditionalities, as Jishnu said. I mean, money is always fungible, right? So we gave, small grants, like 6 months worth of revenues to private schools, which we randomly selected. And these private schools could pretty much do anything they wanted with the money, right? Again, since money is fungible, even though if they said, hey, I'm going to buy a new blackboard, or I'm going to pay teachers' wages, or I'm going to improve my physical facilities, in theory, that money could have also been used for, I don't know, improving the school owner's own house, right? They could have just shown us a check for normal expenses they would have done. And so this was a real test of both intent and effectiveness of the use of this money by a private school owner. And what we found was remarkable. What we found was that not only did the money actually get deployed in the school and was a net addition to the school's own investments, but the money actually led to both private and social returns. And so what we were trying to demonstrate was, if you are an investor, what kind of IRR would we get from this money, which was relevant for us to convince private investors to enter the space. And for the kind of more philanthropic or impact investors, or even sort of public money, was there a social return to this as well? In other words, would you be offering a better product? And the answer is yes to both. And there's some details we can come in the Q&A about how you do it. The other message that we'll be consistently saying is not only is there financial and social return in investing in this sector, but how you invest really matters. And that how is going to be what we hope is also a value add for researchers. People in this room know that you can make returns in this sector because they've actually done it successfully. But what we're hoping research will be able to show is that we can actually modulate those returns to get both higher financial returns and modulate the design of these products to actually get higher social returns. There's going to be a trade-off between the two, and that's a conversation we can have about should we go for blended finance instruments as well, where we have both investors who are looking for pure financial returns, but also investors and perhaps public money behind those investors, which is looking for social return as well. So that was study one. Grants show private and social returns. Then we started moving to saying, now that we have this evidence, can we convince private actors, microfinance organizations, small public finance organizations in our context, again, this was Pakistan, to actually offer a commercially viable loan product in this space? And that's the most recent study, which the first paper is already published, and we're happy to share all of these afterwards, Oliver, with folk. The second paper is a working draft, which is coming out literally today or tomorrow in the next day or so. And that draft now worked with a microfinance organization, and we offered commercially viable for them financial products, but we also offered educational services. I'll focus on the financial product because that's more relevant for the conversation today. And what we find is kind of, I would say, two key results. The first result we find is these financial products actually are commercially viable. So the loans were made, again, this is very little screening. There was some basic screening done by the bank, but we acted mostly as market makers. We introduced these banks to a large plethora of low-cost private schools. Think of us as market aggregators in this space. But that's basically all we did. And then the bank decided whether they're going to lend or not. Of the schools who expressed interest in receiving money, about a third of them eventually actually took the loan. And then what we discover is what is the impact of this loan? And this is what Jishnu said. We find these loans reduce closure rates substantially. In fact, they almost eliminate closure rates. That's how powerful this financial return was. And these loans act in two ways, and I think this is really important. One is you can obviously use the loan money and buy educational products and services, which would be helpful for you. But actually, there's a huge role for loans as an insurance as well. So what we find is the loans give you access to liquidity. In many ways, now that we know our results, we may design the product differently. It could just be literally a line of credit, which you can draw down on when you're in financial distress. And what we're finding is a lot of these schools can go through temporary periods of financial distress. And if you're capital constrained or liquidity constrained, those could be so costly that you have no choice but to shut down the school. Right? So imagine a small enrollment change. You can't buy a third of a teacher, right? So there's a lumpiness in your investments. If you lose 10% of the kids, suddenly you're underwater. But you know that, in the next Harvard season or something else, the next year, there's going to be a positive bump. And so you'd like to retain those teachers and survive. And what these loans are doing is just allowing you to kind of pass over that period. So that's kind of the first key result, that these loans really make a substantial difference in school survival. Sorry, the loans are commercially viable and they make a substantial difference in the school's survival rate. And then we have a nuanced result to say, who do these loans help more? And we find these loans help larger schools and lower quality schools more. And that's a specificity of our context. So let me end over here and just repeat kind of the key messages that can help the conversation. So one, financing of schools is commercially viable. Two, it can, as a result, it generates decent financial returns and it generates social returns. And then third, the specific design of how you make these loans and how you select and how you kind of choose to invest in schools can make a big difference. So design really does make a difference over here. And I'll just stop over here.
Thank you both. So we've heard a bit about the research in this area. So now we're going to talk to people who are working more directly in this area to hear about their thoughts and how that kind of matches or does not with the evidence that Jishnu and Asim have found. So we'll start with Sandeep. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about Kaizenvest and your work investing in the education sector to start with. You're muted.
It's good. Good now. Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. Thanks, Jishnu, Asim, everybody else. Good to be here. We are an asset manager which invests entirely so far in the sector. We call ourselves an impact investor. We are also a bridge between philanthropic participants and impact investors in the sector. And that's an important bridge. It relates to blended finance that Asim referred to a little while back. We've been dedicated to the sector since 2009, and we've been fortunate to partner with some amazing entrepreneurs, very good sort of social enterprises that have created segment leaders in early childhood education in India, the leading higher education, affordable higher education chain in the Philippines and possibly Asia, a leading tech training company in Vietnam. Also, we've invested twice in Varthana, and Steve, you're here, so it's been a great journey with you, and some really exciting edtech companies, both B2C and B2B across Asia, Southeast Asia. So in summary, I think we made 23 investments, and we possibly have the largest number of successful exits in this domain in Asia of any investor over the last 10 plus years. We've also started working in Africa a few years ago, and mostly because of lessons we picked up around education financing. And the work we did was entirely around supporting preschools and early childhood development centers through affordable finance. It's essentially to determine, essentially to support a sector which did not have access to credit. And we supported both formal schools, which were registered, and unregistered schools and preschools, only because we realized such an important part in the growth of a family was played by many of these preschools in the markets we were supporting them in. So yeah, we've started a journey with a desire to really improve education itself. That's how we were. 14 years ago, we thought we'll bring in capital, we'll make education more complete for the learners, better access, better quality. Over the years, though, we've matured, and now we sort of firmly believe that we can and we should improve the world through education. In fact, it sort of aligns well with one of the biggest lessons in impact investing that we've picked up over the years, that founders who intentionally act towards improving lives not only deliver better impact, but also deliver better returns. And that is something we can discuss, Asim, at some stage. How do we balance the theoretical tussle between impact and returns? Is there a tussle? Are they aligned? Where are they aligned? Is it an intentional desire on part of the investor to walk away from returns to leave more impact behind? And does the intention and action of an investor distinguish them from someone that can align and doesn't want to align? So maybe it's an intention issue as opposed to a naturally occurring issue where you could make a choice. So I don't know where the answer lies, but that's a debate definitely worth having, because when presented with that opportunity, we've always at Kaizenvest walked towards more impact and sustainability of the entity. And that makes us more true to education, perhaps. And that's okay. We like it. We think that's a bigger role we have to play. But that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And one more quick question for you, Sandeep. I was wondering if you could kind of reflect specifically on the work that Jishnu and Asim have presented, and yeah, reflect on whether that evidence kind of fits with your experience. But I guess more generally, it'd be interesting to know how this type of academic research can be useful for an organization like yours.
Yeah, it is. There are a few elements of the work which definitely resonate with us in the context of where we work. In markets where there is a real lack of credit, access to ESPs, education service or solutions or products, and finance both will help schools and school systems survive much better, for sure. That just something we've experienced as well. We haven't done a scientific RCT in this space, but based on our own work on the ground, it makes a lot of sense. We've also worked in markets where school credit is available, but with difficulty. In those markets, depending on the social structure of those markets, we've come across data which is even surprising to me. For example, in India at this moment, for the last 6-7 years, except during COVID, public schools have numbers have been declining steadily in absolute terms. Private school numbers have been rising, except for COVID, when for 1 year, private school numbers declined. Now, is that a market pull-based situation? Is it also representative of better access to credit? Or is it just, are we just referring to the more formal registered segment of schools? I don't know. But what it means to me is that it's possibly a combination of multiple factors. And maybe we have a better advanced lending system thanks to Varthana and the likes of Varthana in India. But many markets, I would imagine, suffer from pure simple access to lack of access to finance. And that impedes retention, impedes growth, impedes salaries. And I'm surprised that not more money is going towards the sector in those markets. Is really, really surprising that there could be a political overhang or a social overhang that prevents that capital flow. That is flabbergasting. But I suppose that's the biggest one. And a few other that really resonate well with me is that the intermediate step towards survival is really understanding the independent role of the two interventions, finance and curriculum/services. And that makes a lot of sense. One or the other need not be complementary. They're both super supportive because that shows the intentionality of the underlying entity to me. That's the logic. That's how I rationalize it. But that's pretty much it. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you. So Steve, I was hoping you could start by telling us a bit about Varthana, and also about whether Varthana's experience lending to schools in India has been kind of similar to or different than the experience from the study in Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Great to be here. And it's lovely to hear that there's a theoretical notion from the study that there could be a commercially viable existence lending to schools. And I'm glad to say we've been doing that for 12 years and making profit every year, but our first year when we were still growing and then a COVID year. And so to tell a little bit about what Varthana does and then juxtapose it against some of the observations from the study. We lend only to schools, and I would say we don't filter or select for the most needy of schools or the lowest fee of schools. We try and go as low as we can, but we have seen a level of sustainability that comes around about 200 students per school, which I think the researchers would say that's maybe not the average school. And if you think about the schools in any given country, and I'm sure this is probably similar with our neighbors in Pakistan, they tend to replicate the population, the demographics of the population. And so most of the population is low income. And so most of the private schools are very low fee. And as you move up the pyramid, you start to get to, IB curriculum that's cost as much as it does in the West. And what's interesting, I think another observation is that a lot of people think that it's the demographic growth, the birth rates that have driven the growth of these private schools, but it's more the level of people coming out of abject poverty. And as soon as they get to low income stability, one of the first things they'll do is move their child from the free government school to the most affordable private school. And then they only aspire for more and more equality. And much like most parents, everyone wants the best possible education for their child. And so what Varthana has done is really to try and identify in a given catchment area, in a given geography, at a given fee level, what is the best quality school? And what we saw was, in some respects, our observation in India, there's like 340,000 private schools. And in many markets, you could say that there are too many schools, all substandard sized, suboptimally sized. And what's happened is, as you've heard mentioned here, it's a broken market. There's not efficient capital availability to reward the better performers. And most efficient markets, capital chases after and supports the better performers, and they rise to the top. And so what Varthana has tried to do is identify those schools at $30 a month, at $12 a month, at $5 a month, who's providing the best quality. Let's give them loans so that they can add more seats, another level on the building, expand their infrastructure. And that's where I would say somewhat different to the reflection in the study. When parents start moving their children from lower quality schools to better quality schools at the same price point, that might lead to the other school having to close or to have to reduce its pricing so that they're the best school at the next rung down. But I'm sure this gets pushed to the limit when you start going to much more remote areas where you're right at the baseline of viability if a school can exist or not. But I'm happy to say that over the 12 years, we've lent to over 12,000 schools. The average loan size would be something like $30,000. And this would go principally for infrastructure and support. And we've been able to indirectly, therefore, support something like 7 million students through the schools that we serve. And I just make one additional observation that is what I find very beautiful about this market. You have 340,000 local entrepreneurs from that community who have taken the initiative. They have the property. They've made the first few classrooms. They've taken all of the equity risk themselves. There's no need for equity here. There's no need for venture capital. They just need that petrol to fuel their additional growth on this base that they've set up. And so one of the greatest joys we have is not only, seeing the support to the students, but seeing these often very humble and dedicated local entrepreneurs, get the wind beneath their wings to kind of, amplify what they're already doing so well. So I'll leave it at that for now, but look forward to any questions and dialogue throughout.
Great. And Laura, a final kind of individual question before we broaden it up a bit. I mentioned in the introduction that this is a difficult time for global education funding. I was wondering if you could kind of describe some of what you're seeing and whether there are any specific ways in which you feel philanthropy and impact investing can viably step up to meet the moment.
Yeah, I think Steve, your last point is a great kickoff, because I think we are still seeing education as a #1 priority across all sorts of communities, right? Households continue to put their private income, their private finance into education. Education remains, as far as the latest data, the top priority of domestic philanthropy around the world. It's #2. If you take out Wellcome and Gates, it's cross-border, it's up there too. It's #2 with those two against health. And as you say, there's entrepreneurs all over India stepping up and believing in education. So I think we are seeing a drop, obviously, in aid. The aid actors are, some of them even singling out education as a sector to pull away from. We're also seeing and hearing anecdotally, there's not huge data at the moment, but we're hearing anecdotally that when that comes to a choice, and for some reason it does always come to a choice between health and education, I still remain a little bit flummoxed as to how we have got to that point, because surely that's the last either or we want to be coming at. But we are hearing that ministers of finance are making that choice to prioritize the kind of immediate needs in a health system versus education. And I think it'll be interesting to see some of the dynamics of the education conversation next week at the Financing for Development conference, to see and hear where education is in that kind of broader development financing conversation. Our sense is that education is relatively low down the list in terms of the impact investment conversation. I think you look at some of the data from Jin and others that said, again, not to make kind of crude comparisons to health, but, there is a much more advanced conversation of fluency in language that we don't find so much in education. We also see, I think, at the moment in the aid discourse that education is either missing or sometimes being used as a failed example of aid. And in some of the kind of major media, that is a really worrying trend. And I think one of the things that we're really struck by at IAFG and with some of the partnerships, we had an event at the Education World Forum recently with McKinsey. We hear a totally different narrative from the investment and philanthropic worlds on education. We hear positivity, we hear it's not difficult and complex, it's measurable, it's doable, and there's a real kind of excitement around the question of investing in education. So I think that that difference in perspective when you look at the kind of aid and public sector government world. There is this kind of more negativity and around the language, that education is something that takes a long time and it's it's really complicated. I think that's something that when we explore the spectrum of capital, and I think that's, where our IEFG is a community of 100 different foundations, many of which are the kind of immediate come to mind traditional grant makers, some of which are unrestricted entirely, some of which are more restricted. But then there is this bucket, and I would say a growing bucket, that are trying different financing models. And it's not just, some of them are at the end of impact investing, some of them are social impact bonds or development impact bonds. There's one of them who's doing some really interesting stuff around like conscious asset management. There's a whole suite of tools, of financing tools, and a lot of it is blended finance. I think even for those who are interested, some of them are investing in some of these vehicles, setting up now, the IFEDs and the GPE multiplier and others. I think where we are at the moment is still coming down to the reality that philanthropy is still picking up the slack for some of the payments that governments and schools can't make. And so philanthropy's role at the moment still is a sort of quasi, it is the bridge, Sandeep, as you said. There is a kind of, where schools and governments can't afford it, philanthropy is there to kind of step in and provide that, pick up the risk, basically. We hear from organizations, one of the things we're doing this year is to support the range of philanthropy. So not just those at the kind of more experimental end of financing, but to support the range of foundations to think through what is your role and what are your grantees saying? And what we hear from a lot of the education organizations, not just private schools, not just kind of, kind of chains of private schools, but all sorts of organizations, is they want to expand into models that enable them to become more sustainable, to not depend upon these grants anymore, but they've got no idea where to go. And I think one of the things that in bringing NGOs or education organizations, social enterprises that have been set up for profit, bringing them into a room with investors prompts the realization that, well, hang on, these organizations have got business models, they've got data, they've got, that they're demonstrating returns that are social, many of them not yet financial, but that are demonstrating that education is investable. And I think, going back to what Jishnu said at the start, I think we are in reality a long way from that public-private kind of each side demonstrating terror when you say the other word. I think what these organizations that we're hearing from are saying to us is, can you help us get to that point? Can you signpost? Because as they say, they're in sales mode, whether they're going for philanthropic or investment capital, but they've got no knowledge of how to start navigating the capital space. And I think ditto the other way, when we've talked to some investors, it's really hard to, and Sandeep will no doubt say more than this, it's really hard to identify organizations that are ready, that are sort of there, but we think they are there. We think it's still relatively small, but sense positivity to grow this combination, not in a way that then says, let's just leave state capability and ignore it, but that works with the reality of where we are in so many education systems these days.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a bit of a broader question now, and I'll welcome anyone to jump in if they want to kickstart the discussion. So far we've heard about kind of some academic evidence and some real world experience showing that kind of this model of providing finance to schools can be successful. So I guess my big picture question is, what would it take to kind of jumpstart this financing schools industry at a global level and kind of make some real progress in making this more of a developed phenomenon? And yeah, feel free to, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in first.
Well, I can certainly share some thoughts from brutal firsthand experience. I think one thing that's good to, and Laura kind of repeated it a bit, but I want to emphasize what's amazing is how many pieces of the puzzle already exist. We don't need to build some massive new infrastructure up. You've got parents who are passionate about their child's education and are putting huge percentages of their household income out for the cause. You've got local capabilities of all different flavors and sizes and what have you. And then in the case of India and some other countries as well, you start to now have financial services providers like Varthana. Varthana happens to be super dedicated to this space, but there's a lot of players who have added school finance to their bouquet of different product offerings. And so I think one of the things is just a little intentionality in the flavor of capital that will help us go down market. And I don't think there's any challenge with higher fee, large ticket schools getting financed. But what we're really talking about is how can we push that down to the schools that are offering the low fee solutions. And there you start to get into riskier segments where maybe there are some good risk mitigation roles. I'm always thinking, the size of the problem is so big that you want to leverage as much as possible commercial capital because there's just a lot more of it. But I think philanthropic and blended finance capital can play a very interesting role in helping to mitigate some of the risk of going down market and maybe some of the operational costs there. And we don't yet have any kind of global funding that is really available for those of us that are really dedicated to trying to push to the most needy segments of this sector. So that's one place to start. And then certainly I would say there's a real mixed message going on with the DFIs because there is this notion that somehow low-cost private education undermines human rights. And giving people more options, even if they're low income, I don't understand how that is a violation of human rights. And frankly, the government schools are overwhelmed, right? They've been asked to do a lot more than education. They've become like social delivery mechanisms. But I think maybe, Laura, that's some of the mixed message on the failed experience too, is because the big challenge of the government schools is accountability. And that's when you get with the private schools, the market forces and parents, accountability is not an issue in the private schools. And so you get cost per seat is much less there. Your cost to educate a child is much less in the private sector than it is with the government schools. So if we can get the DFIs on board too, that would be a big help.
This is great, Steve. Oliver, just quickly adding on one conundrum from my perspective. And since we are all dream chasers, we're looking to serve a segment of society which is otherwise underserved. In a market, let's imagine a developed country, it is possible to lend to schools, but my worry is that the lending to schools will chase returns entirely and the capital will concentrate towards the top of the pyramid, because that's where private enterprises play a role. In developing countries, however, a lot of private enterprise serve the bottom of the pyramid, and that's unclear why it is not so obvious to the investors. That in developing markets, when you really don't have government access down to the bottom with all the right educational tools in hand, the private enterprise has to come into play and has to support. And therefore, the opportunity to invest in affordable private schools exists, and the returns are capped. If you do not cap your returns, you will actually be detrimental to the school's health. You can't make like a 30% return, which you could possibly make at the top of the pyramid. You can make a nice 15% return or more. But that doesn't mean that in developing countries, we can create a situation where absent low cost of funding for the lenders, we can have a thriving market. So therefore, India excels at that. There is multiple access points within India for funders like Varthana. But in developed countries, it's really hard. I don't know how that will work because capital, in my opinion, will chase returns and not the creation at the bottom of the pyramid, because that market perhaps doesn't exist. So interesting thought process, but here perhaps lending to a school system at the top of the pyramid could make it worse.
Can I come in with a couple of thoughts, Oliver? So two thoughts, right? One is I'm super interested in this idea that both Sandeep and Steve pointed out, and I want to link the two, which is capital chases the top of the pyramid, right? So here are two big contradictions, right? One thing is we now know that the biggest investments you can make in a child's well-being are when they're young, right? It's 0 to 3, 3 to 10, right? But let's look at where India's going. India created one new college every 8 hours between 2003 and 2018. Every 8 hours, right? So the capital growing to the top of the pyramid is not only which are the best schools, but also which level of schooling are we talking about, right? The second bit, the DFIs, right? We will cite a World Bank 2022 report that basically the IFC said, the International Finance Corporation said, private schools are unlendable because they're small and because they're catering to the bottom of the market. They're unlendable. We are calling poor children unlendable. That's the biggest human rights violation I can think of, is to think of children who are poor, who are marginalized, as being unlendable, right? So what's the big thing that we need to change, right? The big thing, if I talk to the DFI, Steve, what they tell me is, oh, we need to do all this due diligence. It costs us $400,000 to make a loan. We need a CFO. We need a CAO. Fine, I get it. The way we think about that in economics is to say you have a constraint, right? Any constraint comes with what we call a Lagrange multiplier, which is what's the shadow value of that constraint? If I lift that constraint, how much more will I get? And what our research is saying is your constraint is so constraining that you are dooming millions of children in poverty trying to attend these private schools to a shitty life, right? Is that a constraint you can live with? And I think that's worth asking. And then I think the big piece that's missing, I actually genuinely think this, Steve, after you said, look, all the pieces are there, is we don't have the good evidence again and again to say this is producing the returns, this is producing the social returns. Let capital finance the private returns. Let the government finance the social returns. Let the social returns be reached through other places. If we are going to subsidize risky lending, let's do it with some kind of broader financing. But the research on this, Steve, Sandeep, is like seriously missing. We can't go, 20 years back when people used to say, oh, what's the point of the research on education? Well, today, the products that have been thought of as being game-changing are precisely the ones that have the research to back it up, right? So my thing is that the last missing piece is show me the money in terms of this is really helping children. And I think we have started on that journey. Would love to know how we can do more to put it together.
Thanks, Jishnu. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in, but maybe I'll follow up with a related question. So we've kind of talked quite a lot about the why in terms of why this is an important area. We had a question from Ashti Zaidi about the how, so the how this is done operationally. And Ashti was wondering whether anyone could share a little more about how exactly to kind of structure these loans in a way that will deliver the impact that you saw. And also a kind of follow-up question about the impacts was whether there was kind of equitable impacts across groups, or whether any specific groups, such as the marginalized, were more benefited by this.
I can respond to that. So first of all, and this comes back to some of the conversations we've already had, including the IFC quote that Jishnu was referring to. So look, I think there are, you can give financing in a way that enhances competition, or you can give financing in a way that reduces competition. When you give financing in a way that reduces competition, and this is one case where, Sandeep, there is actually a big trade-off between the private return and the social return. When you give money and create effective monopolies, yes, those monopolies will make a lot of money, and from a financial perspective, that sounds great. But when you make an effective monopoly, you destroy innovation, entrepreneurship, competition. And so typically, and I hate to say this, the way multilats have been giving money in education has been creating monopolies. We designate a single winner in a space, and we say, and I won't name chains of schools who have received kind of money like this because I think it's awkward. But effectively,
come on.
sorry.
Oh, come on.
Effectively, what you do is, let me back up once again. We're finding lots of local innovation in this space. Exactly what Steve said. The amount of new ideas, contextualization, targeting, I don't think this is a problem where we don't quite know what to do. There's lots of really interesting ideas emerging. And so this is a space where innovation is a net positive. It's not that, we have a cookie cutter model that'll work everywhere. And so we just need to pick one winner and have that kind of take over the world. And so what we are finding over and over and over in our work, and not just the papers I mentioned, but there's several other papers, is whenever we come in with financing that sort of levels the playing field, if you will, everyone has in theory access to that money. Suddenly you get a very different outcome. So in the grants paper I mentioned, we actually show this in an experimental way. So in some villages, we only gave money to one. We randomly picked one school and gave it money. It wasn't even a winner, Steve. It was just one school out of many. And in other markets, we gave money to all the schools, private schools in that. And we see a fundamentally different response. When you give money to one school and it kind of knows it's now the resource game in town, it does what I would refer to as a market stealing strategy. It basically tries and grabs children from other schools by offering just a small improvement, maybe a slightly better space, maybe slightly better textbooks or something. But there's no change. So we see this school gains by getting enrollment, mostly from other schools, makes very little investments in enhancing quality. So that's kind of the pick a winner, only a single winner model. When you pick multiple winners, if you will, we see a very different result. What we find is now the market stealing strategy doesn't work, right? Because you all have money. So you can't just grab children from the other school, which grabs children. That's a net zero, right? So instead, what you do is you adopt what we would call a market growing strategy. You are essentially trying to extract more returns from parents, but you can only do that by offering parents a better quality product. I think Steve is exactly right. Parents want to move up the quality ladder. And so the critical design feature for us, and we've argued even how we prioritize, like think of how central banks prioritize sectors. It's not just about education. When you prioritize a sector, we're making a very different argument. We're saying what you should do is not just pick a sector, you should increase the density, the geographic density of lending in a space. When you do that, that's a very different policy. When you do that, now everyone in that space is pushing up. The rising tide is going to raise everyone. And I would say a comment about public schools over here as well. What we find is really phenomenal complementarity between public and private investment. When private schools improved, I think Steve is right again to something you said earlier, Steve, about accountability. Public schools may not have as great accountability through the democratic or electoral system, but they do in the local system. So when a private school improves, the public school ends up improving as well, because now there's a counterpoint that parents can use to complain locally to the teacher. You don't need to go to a politician. You could just knock on the public teacher's door every day and say, why is my kid not getting good quality in education? And the previous refrain was, well, your kid must not be that good. Now I can say, wait a second, that same kid in a low-cost private school is doing fine. So it can't be my kid or my household. It has to be the school. And that puts a lot of local pressure. So we're finding we have results to show that when private school quality improves, public school quality improves. And vice versa, by the way. When public school quality improves, there's a question about grants to the public sector. That should also, I don't want to exclude the public sector. If we can give support, the public sector is also capital constrained, by the way, especially locally. So when we give local grants to public schools, we see they improve quality and we see the private school improves quality. So I do think design, these are just examples of how design matters. The one last thing I'd like to say is Laura said something which I think is profound, and I want to sort of double click on that. Laura mentioned that how there is a dropping interest in education from sort of the typical actors, and private actors or foundations are coming in. And Laura raises it as a puzzle, and I think it is a valid puzzle to say, look, If you ask any one of us, whether we're rich or poor, or sitting in the US, or sitting in Pakistan, or sitting in India, or sitting in Singapore, what is the single most important thing you can do for your future, for your family's future? The only answer we will give is invest in our children's education. So at some level, it's so patently obvious that societies can only improve by doing this. I joke and say, look, the biggest scarce resource we have, especially with the way fertility is declining, is people, is young people. That's the only asset any country has ever had. But then the disconnect between that realization, which all of us, including those institutional investors, Laura, who are deciding not to put money in education anymore, when you ask them what they do with their kids, if you said, hey, do you want to take your kids' education budget away and put it in something else? Not a single one of them will answer that way. There's a very bizarre intellectual disconnect. I do think, though, this is my last point to Jishnu's earlier point, I think the onus is a bit on us as well. Let me take some of the blame. We in education, by focusing on test scores as our ultimate outcome, we were doing it because we felt this was easy to measure, not easy, but relatively easier to measure and very objective and tangible. I think that was a right instinct. But there's a dark cloud to that right instinct, which is by doing that, the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Economy or the growth person in a country thought that we were no longer relevant to their conversation. Because what's the link between test scores and growth or productivity or employment or self-employment? We're now changing that. The work we're beginning to do, both in the work Jishnu and I are doing, but also other colleagues of ours, we're now beginning to look at the measurable long-term effects of foundational learning changes. It's doable, right? We can go back and say in 20 years, this is how much education adds to your GDP. In fact, I would make an even stronger statement. The only way I know how to add to your GDP right now is through education. So I want to come back to what Laura said earlier. We need more research, and we need to communicate this so we can get back the growth conversation, get education back into the growth and the productivity conversation. Then I think we can unlock some of this capital. For now, I'm hoping, Laura, that between the private philanthropy and the foundations who understand this, we have enough steam already, enough sort of momentum, that we can produce this sort of work, demonstrate these returns, and get more and more of the public and large multilaterals to come back and recognize this is the only way to have a society develop and grow. Or at least one of the major ways. I shouldn't say the only way, one of the major ways. Let me stop.
That was great. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in there, or
Just a quick comment, Oliver. I mean, I don't think it's a big puzzle. I think the big issue, Laura, that to think about is societies are aging. So what people view as a sectoral conflict, for me, is a generational conflict, right? I mean, one of the things that has been going on is older generations have been pulling up the ladder as they move up, right? And if you look at something like the NHS and the health cost as life expectancy has increased, right? It's primarily the older generation saying, dude, you need to fund my retirement and my healthcare first, now that my kids are out of the education space. Asim, I think that's where the contradiction is not there, right? And I think it is, I'm starting to become more sympathetic to the health view as I grow older, but that's, of course, the wrong thing to do, right? And so I think there is a conflict here that's generational, that will get worse as life expectancy goes up and the cost of treating people who are much older with multiple chronic illnesses is going to rise. And I think that's the conflict, because those people, their kids are done with education, right? And I think that's just worth keeping in mind as we think about this debate.
Can I maybe jump in with something that's controversial in a room of economists and businessmen, right? Is that, and like, I come from a politics background and very much think about education as building identity, as building, like political stability, critical choice, all of this sort of thing. And I think what we're ultimately talking about here is a world in which you get parents to be able to have that choice for their kids. I mean, Jishnu, I remember talking with you years ago about how parents were making choices, yes, to go from public to private, but it wasn't on learning outcomes, because that was a language that was totally new. And like, what's a learning outcome relevant to a job? It was to get that piece of paper in the hand to be able to then go and get the job. And I think there's a big wave coming now as to, well, what are the jobs that graduates who get that certificate even are going to be going into. And, so there's all sorts of kind of, Asim, coming back to your question on what is it that we're measuring, and what are the tipping points that are going to influence people's choices. But I guess I do, I think the narrative that we're talking about here, we're presuming one around kind of growth and economics, but I think the broader narrative around education has become a little bit, I think, too human capital oriented. Saying that, within the sort of spectrum, if you take philanthropy on the very light touch end of, yes, it's private capital, but it's kind of giving it away for altruistic means, all the way through to for-profit business that is not selling education products, but genuinely working in whatever business they're doing. We see a few, and Sandeep, I think the conversations I have with you are amongst those, in this tiny, tiny group of people who can see financial return, yes, but social return being a good thing. And there is, for example, there's a really interesting group of businesses in the Philippines who have got really frustrated that they don't have the employee base that they want. So they've sort of worked backwards from investing in higher education. That's not expanding it much either, because there's this tiny group of elites that get to that point. TVET, still, they've kind of been schooled to the point that it's not really expanding to what we need, and it's short term because it's also not improving the kind of consumer customer base we're looking for. Anyway, they've ended up investing in school meals, foundational learning, and trying to increase, as exactly what your research says, that if you invest big and invest early, you get all sorts of exponential returns that are beneficial to everybody. And I think one of the challenges that we have across the education space is that we tend to sit in our bit of the conversation. We tend to sit in the, we work with private schools, or we work on foundational learning, or we work in early childhood. And part of the challenge, I think, is how to pull back from all of that and make the narrative about education one that is really positive and can do, and it's a worthy investment, because I do think we've lost that, whether it's a generational shift or otherwise. But I think too, is to try and join that up, is to try and start building those kind of, because that is the reality of organizations and schools and others that are delivering on the ground. I hate that phrase, but this is not a choice between different bits of it. And I think we've got bedded down into that kind of sub-siloed argument that is kind of helpful for no one. So I think a lot of it here is around language and culture and narrative for education, and hope that while the aid cuts of this year were not they're not the kind of cause of a whole new wave of thinking and debate, they're a symptom in many ways of changes that were happening anyway. I do think that this conversation now about how do we bring more capital into education and see it as a good thing, and yes, there are, we can all shape that, there is a potential to shape future. I think that's a really important conversation to be having right now.
I just wanted to add to what Laura said, just on that thread. I think it's critical to recognize that when we talk about returns to education, both private and social, they're not just economic returns. Look, we're just not to be tone deaf to the story of the world today. We're on the brink of a third world war, right? We're on the brink of extreme polarization, or actually are already there. A lot of xenophobia. I think so if I say one tragedy in education is we should really be thinking of long-term returns and recognizing and measuring and showing how they are, to kind of get back into that sort of conversation. I also think we need to be recognizing that it's not just about how well you do in math or science or your language, that things like empathy or tolerance or grit or democratic values are things which are teachable. They're not terribly different from math. I mean, they are and they aren't, right? And I think this distinction we make between teaching math and that empathy is something you're just born with, either you have it or you don't. That's like saying mathematicians are born, either you are or you aren't. So I think it's silly. And so I want to agree with what Laura said, which is when we think of these returns, and especially when we have investors coming in who are more socially minded, we should recognize and show, by the way, and we're beginning to measure these things, that same education experience, a higher quality school, not just generates better test scores in whatever subjects you want, but can produce a more civically minded, a more socially minded, a more magnanimous individual as well. And those are the things we should be willing to put our money behind, because gosh, the costs of that the financial costs of that, what we're seeing now. I mean, we're even only in this conversation because we have collectively decided to spend more money. I don't know how else to put it, Jishnu, so I'll just say to kill people than to have people thrive. Like that's a conscious choice we're making in society. And for me, that's a fundamental failure on certain basic human capital values, if you will, or human capital attributes. And so I think there is a massive return to that as well. So absolutely, Laura.
I'd just echo on one final piece on that, I take some inspiration about all the funding that's gone into sustainability and clean energy and what have you, because right now we've talked about all the aspirational elements of education and how it helps. And there might be something to learn about the doomsday approach. Because we're funding clean energy not to make a more beautiful planet, but to try and put off the apocalypse, right, and the destruction of this one. And I don't think that people look at often enough the looming crisis that will come from this massive youth population that is emerging in the subcontinent, in sub-Saharan Africa. And you take that massive youth population, undereducated, completely aware of how the rest of the world is living, and having been promised that if you just work hard enough, you'll live better than your parents and what have you, it's not going to be a pretty outcome. And so one of the things that compelled me to get into this was, you think the costs of education are high right now. I mean, the cost of not educating will just be insane. And I feel like more than seeing the dollars go to healthcare, I can't tell you how many times I've been offered funding if I will put solar panels on schools. So apparently the schools are a location to put solar panels, not a location for educating the children. And it's crazy, and it makes no sense for the schools to pay for solar panels, but I can get funding cheaply if I will do it for energy, but not for education. It's just crazy.
Sandeep, were you going to come in now, or shall I move on to?
Oh, nothing further to say. It's isn't it exciting to hear everything here? So I'm just very excited to listen to everybody here and agree with everything almost. So that's great.
Can you be a burst of optimism, please, after this?
So yeah, so I
from
think
Asim and
we're not
Laura and
giving up.
Steve.
No,
Give me a
we're not
burst of
giving up,
optimism.
right, Jishnu?
No, we are not
We
giving
on
up.
the road and we are raising capital and we are trying to come up with various methods by which we can bridge the communication gap between investors and the investees. We are, in fact, undertaking projects which are trying to connect the two of them through evidence. And evidence is the burden, in my opinion, which is a sector like education has taken it upon itself, where no other sector takes upon the burden of evidence on themselves to say, I will prove to myself that I am doing good work. Climate people don't do that. Healthcare people don't do it. Yes, there are studies that third parties will do, and there are evidence of healthcare efficacy, which are pretty obvious. A life is saved. Education evidence is so long-term and so subliminal and so social, so political, so at the very core of a human, that just attributing evidence to test results or attributing exactly what you're saying, Asim and Laura, to one aspect of who you are and what you need to be educated in today is vastly different. Look at the number of people who are unemployed from Ivy Leagues, from all the best colleges. It's as if the top tier college students from whichever country you look at, a lot of them, I don't know what percentage, anecdotally, forget the unemployment numbers, a lot of them don't have jobs or the right kind of jobs. And it is horrible. So I think this is a wake-up call. One thing we need to, as education supporters, need to really evaluate, what are we educating in? I think we need to teach more of empathy, less of English. But it's hard to say that today because all the exams for college entrance are in English. So it's just an example. I'm not saying we need to do it right away, but we're heading in a direction where we will soon have a world which speaks a single language but has forgotten core values because we taught so much of the hard skills and forgot the core human skills. And that is becoming much more important today, way more important than we attributed. It'll be clearer to us as we go further along, as the human values become more distinguished, the more AI and technology that seeps into workplaces. So I'm realizing that we are just learning a few things as the world economy is changing. Microsoft's laying off 15,000 people. We say AI won't cause loss of jobs. I fully agree. But to make room for AI innovation, there has to be budget cut. That's a different take of why jobs will be lost. It's not because AI is causing the loss of human jobs, because AI is taking over human jobs. It's because we need to create room in budgets, which are shrinking. There's a tussle. So I think we are at a point which is super exciting. We have to fight the fight. We have to bring smart capital in, and we are on it. So yeah, we will put the burden upon ourselves, whatever it takes, including evidence. Yes, so we shall do it.
I think that's a great note to end on, unless anyone else has any final thoughts. There are some questions that we didn't get around to in the chat, but I think they're quite kind of specific and will be covered in the paper and article that you're going to release on your research, Jishnu and Asim, in the coming days. So make sure you pay attention to the VoxDev website for that, and we'll also email attendees with a link to that article. And some people have asked, yes, this webinar has been recorded and is available now on our YouTube, so feel free to share that with people you think might find it of interest.
Oliver, are we out of time, or I forget when do we end? Or
we had like a couple more minutes, but I also thought that was a nice end note, so I didn't know.
There were some comments to Laura. I don't know if she wanted to answer them specifically, but ours we've answered.
Yeah, what I can do is I can take a copy of the questions and then send any specific ones to you guys after the event, so you can see them. Great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining. That was a really interesting discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone attending did as well. And yeah, we'll be in touch with some more details on this as well.
Thank you, everyone.